In today's daily lectionary reading from the Gospel of Mark, we encounter a pair of stories that no other Gospel writer places side by side like this. The way Mark arranged these two stories helps us interpret both stories and give them a real depth of meaning. A couple of weeks ago, I talked about the way the writer of Mark frequently used a literary method scholars sometimes call an insertion. He starts to tell one story, then abruptly inserts another story, and finally returns to complete the first story. And it's a good thing, too, because one of these stories today always leaves people scratching their heads, trying to understand why Jesus would say the things he says here. Mark's arrangement of the two stories answers that mystery. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Tuesday, February 14th, 2023. These two stories are set on the day after Jesus enters Jerusalem on what we call Palm Sunday, and the day after that. The first story begins as Jesus heads to the temple. The second story occurs when he enters the temple. And finally, the third section takes place the next morning after Jesus has left the temple and goes back to the same place he had begun. Keep that sequence in mind as I read this passage. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see whether perhaps he would find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves, and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers." And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. In the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. Then Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered." The opening and closing story about the cursing of the fig tree strikes many people as odd. It's not fig season, and yet Jesus curses the fig tree for having no figs on it. It seems strange, out of character. Surely, we think to ourselves, this must be an aberration. Maybe the story got garbled over the decades between Jesus' death and the time when the gospel writers started committing these stories to paper. But Mark, the earliest gospel writer, tells us and helps us enormously by inserting the second story, the story of the cleansing of the temple, within the story of the cursed fig tree. Mark's method of inserting one story inside another is his way of helping us interpret each story through the lens of the other. In this case, both stories tell us the same thing. The fig tree apparently had every appearance of being active and healthy and productive, but actually had no fruit on it. In the same way, the temple had the appearance of a bustling, active, vital place. There was a lot of activity going on, which would be expected with the coming of Passover. But the buzz of activity covered the fact that the religious life of the temple and of its leaders was spiritually barren. Like the fig tree, it had the appearance of health, but actually produced no useful fruit for the kingdom. All of its apparent busyness revolved around the business of making money off the pilgrims who came to the temple for the high holy days. It was busy, sure enough, but with the wrong things. The temple should have been a source of hope and healing and restoration. Instead, it had become little more than a center of commerce and trade. This story should resonate with us today. There are a lot of churches that have all the appearance of being busy and filled with activity, but which are in fact spiritually barren. Any church can become spiritually dead and barren in spite of the appearance of activity. Is it a place where people go to see and be seen? Or is it a place that provides spiritual nourishment to all who come in its doors? Is it a place where important people go to expand their network of business prospects? Or is it a place that cares for the least and the lost? The temple seems to have been like a modern church that had forgotten what its true purpose was. It wasn't to make money trading Roman coins for the Jewish shekels that were the acceptable coins for offerings. It wasn't to profit off the sale of animals for people to offer to the priests who would make sacrifices on people's behalf. Its purpose was to be a light to the nations, a place to which, in the words of the prophet Isaiah, in the days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be raised above the hills. All the nations shall stream to it. Many peoples shall come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths." Tomorrow, Jesus tells a provocative parable. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.